Thank you so much. Do I sound like I'm yelling at you? No? Okay. So I'm going to be fully transparent. This is the first time I've used a microphone, and it is frightening to hear your voice that loud. So please pray for me and I appreciate your grace. But Tim, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. I cannot tell you how excited I am to be here and how welcoming your group has been to me. I appreciate that so much. But I'd like to jump into the presentation, and today we're going to have a conversation. So at any time, if you want to ask a question or share an observation, I'd love to hear it. But it's really a conversation about what it's like to grow up in a very anxious world and how that affects us as we go into our adult lives, and even how it affects future generations that our families continue on the anxiety cycle. So, included in your packet is just a quick agenda that has a broad overview of what we'll talk about today. But I really kind of want to jump in and start talking about the anxiety cycle and what exactly I mean when I reference that. But before we do this, I feel like I need to address the elephant in the room. And I feel like you're probably sitting out there in the audience thinking, what in the world was Tim thinking asking an HR professional to come talk about anxiety? Because HR creates anxiety. So I just want you to know that Tim has not lost his mind, but who he really asked to come speak to you today is the 4-year-old Jannette. So this is a picture of me when I was 4, and I'd like to introduce this Jannette to you, who will be speaking with you today. This Jannette loves baby dolls, she loves flowers, and she loves the color pink. And if I'm being honest, she still loves the color pink. She hates noogies. So has anyone ever experienced a noogie? You probably all have older siblings, right? They get you in the headlock, they make a big fist, and then they rub it as hard as they can across your head until you say whatever they do is appropriate. Something like, yes, you are king, and then they stop, right? Hate noogies. She also hates kites that chase you. So just a word of advice, if you're going to train a child how to fly a kite, do not buy one that looks like a bat. Even if it's the last one in the store, wait another day. And then she doesn't like flip-flops. I can't explain that one, but she just doesn't. But Jannette, as a child, had to assume responsibilities well above the level of her age. And oftentimes it was at the level of an adult. Because as a child, I was a child caregiver. And that is anyone who's under the age of 18 that provides care, support, assistance, whether it's physical or emotional, to an adult. And in most cases, it's to a parent. Okay? So my mother suffered from a severe anxiety disorder. And because of that mental illness, she wasn't able to stay by herself at all. She had to have someone with her 24/7. And in addition, she couldn't handle any type of going out in society. So she couldn't go to the grocery store. She couldn't go to my school events. She would have severe panic attacks. And so my role as a child was to assist my father with those things that my mother would normally, should have been able to do. And then also to stay with my mom 24/7. So the only time that I wasn't at home with my mom was when another family member would come in and stay with her. And that wasn't very often. My father, we're a one-income family, so my father worked in construction. He worked long hours every day except for Sunday. And he had a lot of responsibility on his shoulders. So he wasn't available a lot of times. My grandmother would come over, and that would allow me to go out and spend time with friends or what have you as I was growing up. But this was the environment that I was raised in, not only in my young years, but all the way up through my teenage years. So as you can imagine, I grew up in a very stressful, anxious-ridden environment. I want today to share my experiences, share my discoveries, and even a little bit of research I found, so that maybe as you go out and you help those in your organization, those in your community, or even your family members, that you can help them identify where anxiety may have taken hold in their environment, and this cycle continues within their families. And you can be the one that steps up and helps them break that anxiety cycle. Okay? So when I say anxiety cycle, this is really what I'm talking about. A couple of days ago, I did a quick Google on anxiety cycle and realized there's all kinds of definitions out there for that term. But today, for our discussion, we're talking about when an individual has a traumatic experience. And because of that experience, they start viewing the world with a very anxious lens. And if that's not dealt with, then they continue to develop unhealthy behaviors trying to cope with that anxiety. Then they model those unhealthy behaviors. So we all know that children learn by watching others. They watch the behaviors of others. And so that individual will model unhealthy behaviors to the next generation. That next generation can be their children, or it could be younger siblings. It could be coworkers. It could even be students that they're teaching. It's anyone that looks to them as a role model. So the next generation learns these unhealthy behaviors. They continue forward, and they teach it to the next generation. So it's a vicious cycle that never ends until someone steps in and asks the question, why are we responding in this manner? Why are we allowing our fears, our doubt, our worry to actually dictate the decisions we make in life? So I'm going to share with you just a couple of statistics that I found. One of them you're probably very familiar with, and that's the first one. It's from the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, which basically states that anxiety disorders are the most common mental illness in the United States. So that means roughly 40 million or 19% of individuals in the United States suffer from some type of anxiety disorder. But the second statistic is one that I found really interesting, and that was from the National Alliance for Caregiving. They actually joined together with AARP and did a study on caregivers. And they, I keep doing this, I need to be doing that. So this is a section out of that study. And when they talked to caregivers, and caregivers in this situation, any individual that was paid to provide care to an adult, and these individuals, of course, were adults themselves. But one of the comments they made in the study was that, as you can imagine, there are other caregivers in the home that are not paid. But what they noted was, and they estimated the number to be 3.4 million of those unpaid caregivers were children, standing in the shadow, no one recognizing their contributions. And that struck home to me because I was one of that 3.4 million. So today, I'd like to shed light. I'd like to give some credit to those child caregivers and just let you know a little bit about what it looks like to be a child caregiver. So that is horrible. That will be corrected. But a child caregiver there's 4 things I'm going to share with you, and that is they are the best kept secret of the family. What they contribute to the family, many times a parent won't share outside of the home because they feel shame for not being able to truly fulfill the role of a parent. The child won't share what they do outside of the home, one, because they fear rejection from their peers. They don't think anyone can really understand the dynamics of their family, and so that they don't want to be rejected. But secondly, they also don't want anyone to think badly of their parent, because a child caregiver is very protective of their family. So it remains a secret that the family keeps. And we all know secrets start affecting you not only mentally, but your physical self the longer you keep them. They also provide 24/7 care to a family member. So let's just pretend that you could actually find care 24/7 that's provided in a person's home. The cost would be astronomical. So what a blessing these child caregivers provide to their family to be able to assist at this level. They understand the family member's condition and triggers better than anyone because they live it. So they see what triggers a family member that's challenged with a mental illness. They see what calms them. They know how to step in and how to create that calm environment so that everyone remains happy. Because even though the child caregiver doesn't understand all the specifics of what the family is challenged with, they know how to read a room. And their ultimate goal is to be happy and for their family to be happy. And so they learn ways to accomplish that. And that goes to my next point, is that child caregivers are very resilient and they are strong problem solvers. And it's because of that desire and being placed in a caregiver role of wanting their families to be happy and healthy. You know, one thing I didn't mention before when we were looking at that anxiety cycle is there an individual named Michelle Poehler, and she started a foundation called Hello Fears. And when she started the organization, her hope was to help people face their fears so that it wouldn't limit the possibilities that they had in their lifetime. So one thing that she mentioned, she did a presentation that I was at, and she mentioned that her grandparents were survivors of the Holocaust, and they actually left Nazi Germany and moved to Venezuela. But even though they escaped that situation, they brought their fears with them. And then the grandparent taught those fears to her mom, who taught them to her. But one day she asked, why do I have these fears? What's the reason behind this? And that's when she started her journey of rewiring, if you will, herself. So knowing that these unhealthy behaviors could be rewired to have a more healthy response. And that gave me hope because I think we can be the one for our families, for our organizations, communities, that can stand up and be the one and help them break the cycle as well. So I just wanted to mention that briefly before we move on. So as you can imagine, being a child caregiver is very difficult. And you know how when you have a new job, there's some organizations that you start and they have like a 12-week plan. They teach you the culture of the organization, they teach you about your job, and then you start slowly learning a task. And then there's other organizations, when you start the job, they call it on-the-job training, and you get thrown into it, and it's like sink or swim. Well, being a child caregiver is like on-the-job training. You're just kind of thrown in there, and there's not anyone really to guide you. So when I was going through research, one of the things that came up was that child caregivers will respond to being thrown into that environment in two ways. The first one is they're overwhelmed and they can't manage it, so they look for escape. And they may find escape through alcohol, drugs, unhealthy relationships. My older brothers went that route. So the one good thing about that route is as they became adults, it was very easy to see that they had unhealthy behaviors that needed to be addressed. And so they sought, even though they didn't realize it was related to being a child caregiver, they sought help because those are things that you can easily see from an external perspective that needs to be addressed. The other route child caregivers will go is becoming an overachiever. So they see their escape route as actually being education. The more education they get, the more prepared that they'll be able to move forward. That's the route I took. So that's why when Tim was introducing me, I got like an alphabet soup behind my name because I thought education was going to be my escape. So when you go that route, you think, well, that's a good route. I mean, that's a positive thing. But even though I was successful in my career, I got promotions, I am the best at conflict resolution because of my child caregiver training. I had lots of success externally. Internally, young Jannette still existed, and I was a hot mess. I had all kinds of behaviors that were unhealthy that needed to be wired, but I didn't know it because all I ever knew was growing up in this very anxious world. And so that's even harder to identify and then address when you become an adult. And it really does take someone on the outside looking in and being that one that says, hey, have you ever thought about this? Have you ever thought about how you respond in that situation as unhealthy and figuring out why you respond in that way? Because that's the first step to take if you want to break this anxiety cycle. So being the overachiever I was, I started researching everything. And of course, you start with Google, right? So I go there, type in what I'm looking for, and article after article comes up about being a parent that is suffering from mental illness and what not to do as you raise your children. Well, that ship had sailed for me. I was already raised. And so I needed help knowing what to do with this, because my parents did the absolute best that they could with the resources that were available at that time. But I still was wired with anxiety in every part of my body. So I wanted to know, how do I address that as an adult? Fortunately, I was completing my master's degree, and I had access to a research library. So I went through hundreds of studies, and I found 2 that dealt with child caregiving. And I want to share some of the results with you on that. The first one was called The Fractured Journey of Growth. And this one was interesting because it actually interviewed 7 child caregivers and asked for their perceptions on being a child caregiver. What did it feel like? What were some of the struggles they went through? It didn't interview the mentally ill parent, which is unusual at this time for studies. What was interesting is, of the 7 participants that were interviewed, there were common themes that emerged. And just to give you kind of a taste of what those things were, I want to read to you a paragraph from the study. And when I read this, I thought, I have found my people. Because this is exactly how I felt as a child, but unfortunately, I bottled all those emotions up and didn't realize it until I read this passage. So, the researcher states, these participants described an existence of isolation and abandonment in childhood, where their personal and emotional safety was secondary to others' needs, the parent or adult with the mental illness. This extended to feeling invisible, where not only parents, but society seemed unaware of their plight and social disconnectedness. They spoke of not feeling secure or valued with unpredictable parenting. A sense of being betrayed compounded feelings of guilt and sadness. Behaviors learned to hide the truth of family life led to secrecy and shame. Safety and survival absorbed their energy as they navigated their way through reverse parenting, their unwell parent, and the never-ending madness. However, these experiences were described as being a double-edged sword. They recognized as adults inner strengths of empathy and compassion, and their ability to resource themselves in difficult situations had emerged from their childhood plight. They recognized education as a conduit out of their childhood despair and made conscious decisions about their own way of being in a world without mental illness. So even though child caregivers have many struggles, they also have many positive things they learn that need to be celebrated. And so this study has a lot of great information on the specifics of being a child caregiver. The next study was children caring for parents with mental illness. And this one interviewed both the parents suffering from the mental illness and the child caregiver. So it gave a great perspective, kind of a complete picture by interviewing both individuals. They interviewed 40 families, and from that, there's lots of wonderful takeaways, but the thing that really stuck with me is that mental illness affects the family. And even though, in most cases, we are only treating the individual with the diagnosis, right? Or we might have a support group for the adult caregiver in the family. But you don't generally see an entity that brings the entire family together and tries to support and care for that family as a team, where everyone hears the whole story of what's going on and everyone plays a part, which is really the definition of a family, right? It's God's eternal team. So I thought it was interesting that even though the studies show that mental illness isn't just a diagnosis of one, but it's a condition of a family, that we're not treating it that way. So food for thought. Child caregivers, through all of the research that I did, which honestly I could put on one hand because there's just not a lot of information out there about children providing this type of care to parents. And rightfully so, because like I stated before, it's a secret that families want to keep so that there's not a stigma applied to them. But throughout the research, there are two struggles that child caregivers have. And I want to share those with you because it may resonate with you, either because of the people that you serve or maybe even personally. So the first one is separation anxiety. And that's normal for children. Usually if they're going to be away from their parents viewed as their safety realm. And so there's fear whenever they're separated. But for a child caregiver, that's not the fear. The fear is they're going to be away from their parent or family member and not be available if they're needed. So the parent's going to need something and they're not there, and that creates the anxiety. An example in my life is, I had reoccurring nightmares throughout my childhood. And normally nightmares would be, vampires, Bigfoot, maybe in today's world, zombies. But my reoccurring dream that I had for many years was that I wanted to go trick-or-treating after school. And my mom told me, no, I need you to come and stay home with me right after school. But school ends and I think, I can get a couple of houses in, Mom won't know. And I go and I'm trick-or-treating and I'm so happy, and time goes by and it's nighttime. My aunt drives up in her car in my dream and says, Jannette, what are you doing? Your mom is home alone. And I wake up. So I never know if my mom's okay or not. And I have that anxiety when I wake up, that fear that I didn't take care of my mom. That is an example of separation anxiety for a child caregiver. And as an adult, you don't grow out of these anxieties. They just morph into new, different ones that's more relatable at the adult level. So for many years, I became very anxious if I was going to be late. And it didn't matter to what. It could be to a family event, something at work, going to my child's soccer game. I would start having a panic attack if I was going to be late to that event. And I always thought that it was just how I was wired. I'm a very conscientious type person, and I want to, meet everyone's expectations. But the reality was that was an anxiety that morphed into a different anxiety when I became an adult, but it actually started as a child. And then the second struggle that child caregivers go through is social anxiety. Because many times, because of their responsibilities at home, they're not put into social situations as children. So those play dates don't happen. The only time I was around children was when my cousins would come to visit, which wasn't often. So when I started kindergarten, I'm thrown into a room with a bunch of kids my age, and I have absolutely no idea how to relate. I'd always been around adults, so I was very comfortable being around adults, but children, no clue. And so that becomes an anxiety of its own. And as an adult, that morphs into having difficulty establishing close relationships. So I want to revisit the anxiety cycle, and I want to look at it from a generational perspective. And I also want to insert that child caregiver into our new cycle here. So as we said before, it starts with an adult who's had a traumatic experience. And then if that's not addressed, they start modeling unhealthy behaviors to the next generation. But if you have a child caregiver that's inserted there, now you have an individual that's not only being trained to view the world from an anxious lens, but they also have their own traumatic experience, the emotional trauma of being placed in a role where they care for an adult, something that's beyond their years of service or years of experience. And so they have their own traumatic experience, plus they have training from the role model that's confirming all of that anxiety-ridden fear that they have. So then they turn and they, not knowing that they were raised in an environment of anxiety because that's all they've known, they turn to the next generation and they train those same unhealthy behaviors to them. So for me, I was truly clueless. I knew my mother had an anxiety disorder. I knew how it affected her, but I had no idea that I had wired that anxiety into my own behaviors. I was successful. I mean, I had a good job, I had a great family, but I thought me letting fear and doubt always bubble up inside was just normal. Everyone had that, but they don't. I was taught to be that way, and because of my circumstances, I developed my unhealthy behaviors. So now I have 2 sons of my own, and I'm teaching them how to view the world from an anxious lens, to allow their fear and doubt to determine their action. Fortunately for me, the one was my husband, and he recognized, he didn't know how to help me, but he recognized when I was training the 2 boys to be anxious, and he would step in and say, no, that's not the best way to manage that. Why don't we consider this? And I can tell you, we had lots of arguments in the beginning of our marriage because I did not appreciate that. I was the mama, but he was right to do that. And I'm so thankful now that I have the discernment and I can see that I was teaching them unhealthy behaviors, that he was courageous enough to be the one to stop it for our family. So let's say that you've been thinking about the individuals you serve, and you have some individuals in mind that you think this could be their story. They could be stuck in an anxiety cycle and need help. Or take it one step further, and this may hurt a little bit more, but think about your own situation. What if this resonates with you personally and you realize you're the one that's stuck in the anxiety cycle? What's the next step? What do you do? Well, the next step is to know your story. You know, if you've ever heard of Brene Brown, she's always talking about owning your story, right? You have to own the good, the bad, the ugly, accept yourself before you can accept others. And I completely agree with that. But I'm going to take this step further and say you have to know your story first. And it has to be the real story, not the one that maybe you put together so you can cope with anxiety. So to know your story, the first thing you have to know is the why behind your actions. Because you may have learned lessons from role models that had a traumatic experience, and those behaviors are unhealthy, so you are stuck in that anxiety cycle. Or you may be the person that had the trauma, and you developed unhealthy behaviors just to cope with that event. So if you know the why, then you can understand and identify those unhealthy behaviors that need to be addressed. This also requires that you face the reality. And that reality is you may have created an inaccurate perception of your childhood. I know I did. If people asked me, I had a wonderful childhood. You know, I grew up in the 80s. My parents weren't divorced. There was no physical abuse. I mean, I felt like I had it all going on. And so not realizing and not allowing myself to remember the challenges that I faced as a child, because I felt like if I did that, it was disrespectful to my parents, which it wasn't, because we all have a right to feel our emotions and work through them. But I convinced myself that was true, so I had an inaccurate perception of my childhood. You may have bottled up emotions just to deal with everyday challenges. If you grew up in an environment where anxiety was there, you absolutely did this. Because whether you were a child or adult, you knew to keep the calm. When you have individuals that's suffering from anxiety disorders, keeping them calm is critical. So any emotion that goes against that, you're going to bottle up. And you're not even going to realize you're doing it in most cases until those emotions decide to come out. And they're not going to do it at an opportune moment. They are going to come out when you least expect it, and you're going to have to deal with it at that time. And then finally, you may have hidden the real you behind a wall, and you only allow individuals to see the perfect you, right? So if you do this, you're never able to be truly vulnerable with others. You're never able to really share your true story, and you'll never have a real connection, which, as we know, God created us to have relationships. That's our purpose here on earth. And if we don't allow others to see our true selves, then we are not going to receive that blessing. I love this quote, and I wanted to share it with you before we move on to our next section. And it's by Carl Jung, and it basically says, "Your vision will become clear only when you look into your heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." And for individuals that grew up in a very anxious world, they're always looking externally for validation or for their value. What I want to encourage you, and I hope you encourage those you serve, is for them to start looking internally, because that's where they're going to discover the gifts God gave them, and that's when they're going to stop limiting themselves from the fear that they have because of the environment that they grew up in. Okay. Any questions or comments so far? So let's talk about mental strongholds. That's our next section. And mental strongholds are basically unhealthy behaviors. So you respond to a situation and you have a choice. You can either let fear, doubt, worry be the guide to how you respond to that situation, or you can look at it from a calm, rational perspective and respond to it in a healthy way. Child caregivers are prone to having lots of strong mental strongholds, but so are individuals that grew up in a very anxious world. And I think that's probably more of us in this room than not. So I'd like to kind of share with you some common mental strongholds and how you can overcome those. False sense of responsibility is a common mental stronghold. I see a few people smiling, so I think I may have some friends out there. When you take responsibility of things that are outside your scope of control, that's when you've delved into false sense of responsibility. It's not healthy for you or the other person. And you cannot be all things to all people, even if they want you to be. So this is what I believe the mother of all mental strongholds. I think for many of us it starts right here. And there are some questions that you can ask yourself to see if you're falling into this temptation. And that is, does it affect my livelihood? Does it affect my health? Does it affect my happiness if I do or don't do this particular action? And the emphasis is all on my. So instead of worrying about and finding value in the reaction of another person, whether they're happy, whether it affects their livelihood, their health, you should really ask the question, if I do or don't do this, does it affect me? Because the only scope of control that you have is with yourself. You cannot control others. So this was one that I really struggled with, largely because as a child caregiver, you know how normally parents have certain boundaries, like they have certain responsibilities and authority, and a child has certain responsibilities and maybe a little bit of authority, not much. But there's distinct lines between the two roles. When you're put in a caregiver role as a child, that gets blurred. And so you really don't understand where those boundaries are. And as a child, you don't have the experience to really think it through and understand it. So you just think everything's your responsibility, and that everyone's happiness is dependent on your actions. And so this is why I struggle greatly with this. So to give you an idea of possible unhealthy behaviors that you or individuals you serve may have, I want to introduce you to my personal mental stronghold squad. Here's my buddies. So the first one is people pleaser Paul. He is the internal yes man, enjoys doing what others want, even if he doesn't have the skill or the ability to do it. He is easily controlled by the emotional response of others. So Paul's happiness depends on pleasing others, on whether they're happy, on whether they're successful. And that is really, he should be the poster boy for false sense of responsibility. And we all know that's not healthy because we can't dictate how others are going to respond to us. My second friend is the invulnerable Ivy. Her greatest accessory is the shield she uses to micromanage situations so others will not see her imperfections. She enjoys Red Bull to maintain the energy required to power her shield. So with Ivy, in order to connect to others, you have to be vulnerable. But she lets her fear of rejection keep her from having that connection, her fear of rejection to have that connection. Perfectionist Pam, and oh my goodness, we're twins, if you didn't realize, perfectionist Pam and me, because she strives to be the best of the best. And she believes anything is attainable if you work hard. And I just wanted to know, she's currently dating Paul, because they have a lot in common. Because think about it. You're trying to be a perfectionist, and I'll tell you, this one, when I discovered this, it was actually in a Brene Brown book where this was discovered. I threw that book across the room, and I did not read it for like a month. I was so upset about this. I'm Generation X. We're not out to please anybody. But perfectionist Pam, why are you trying to be perfect? Who judges whether you're perfect or not? People, right? So really, perfectionist Pam is just taking people-pleasing to the next level. And then we have prideful Peter. He's my buddy. He's easygoing, glad to be part of the team, as long as he can complete the work. He knows how to do it correctly and in the most efficient way. So pride, I always thought was when you're boastful, kind of full of yourself. But what I discovered is it can sneak into our lives in a variety of ways. And this is how it snuck into mine. Because I felt like I had the experience, I could do it, so just let me do it. 5 minutes for me, half an hour for you, I'll just do it. And I didn't realize that one of our roles is to train the next generation, to help them, to teach. And so this was my pride, once again, stepping in the way of me having that connection with other people. So you may see that you have some of these individuals in your life as well. So what do? These are all obviously unhealthy behaviors. How do we rewire them to have a more healthy perspective? I have 5 tools that I use that I'd like to share with you. And here we go. So the first one we've already talked about, and that is to own your story. Actually go back, look at your past, write your story out. Not only look at it through your experiences, but look at it from other people's experiences. So for me, I looked at it from another's perspective of having to deal with mental illness. I looked at it from my father's perspective, who had an amazing amount of responsibility. As a child, I didn't understand his reaction, but as an adult, I realized he suffered from depression. And so he would have many episodes, and that's why he responded in the way he did. And then I looked at it from my brother's perspective, being child caregivers that felt like they needed to escape through rebellious acts. And that gave me a full picture, a clear picture of my past. And then I could say, okay, so what are my behaviors that draw from this that need to be rewired to be more healthy? Identify your why. That's looking at your behaviors and deciding why you do that and whether they're good or bad. And I want to take a moment to say, if they're good, celebrate that. I am so excited and appreciative that I am resilient because of my childhood. I'm a good problem solver, I'm compassionate, I have empathy. Those are all things that came out of my childhood that are good, and I celebrate those. But I also recognize, because of my childhood, I have walls where I don't let people in. And I need to stop that, because to have a true connection, I need to be vulnerable. So that's a behavior I need to rewire. You also need to take care of yourself. And I put this here, and a lot of times when people say this, like, yeah, we know we're supposed to take care of ourselves. But there was actually research done, and it was by Dr. Harris, Nadine Harris, and she wrote The Deepest Well, Healing Long-Term Effects of Childhood Adversity. And what she found is if individuals, especially children, would focus on being healthy in these areas, it actually reduced the effect of stress on their bodies. So yeah, we should do it, but honestly, if you want to break those mental strongholds, if you want to break that anxiety cycle, you also need to make sure you're taking care of yourself in these 7 areas as well. And then we have renew your mind. This is so important because you're going to have to go on a discovery process of your own. I, in my book, have several steps that I took, things that worked for me, and I talk about the mental strongholds I overcame. But at the end of the day, you are unique. The individuals you serve are unique. You're going to have your own unhealthy behaviors to discover, and you're going to have to discover what works for you. So going out, doing some research of your own, and asking for help. That help may be professional counseling. It may be as simple as journaling your experiences so you get those emotions out, or it could be hiring a coach. And a coach could be someone that's a trusted friend that has your best interests at heart that you can speak to, or it may be a professional coach that helps you identify those mental strongholds and create a process to which to overcome it. It doesn't matter, there's no wrong answers. What's important is that you start the process of finding out what works for you. And then, of course, lastly, healthy boundaries. And that is setting expectations for the relationships in your life. That will help you overcome that false sense of responsibility. So having open and frank conversations with people in your life to say, this is what I can give you. And this is what I hope to receive back from you. And knowing that you need to stay within that boundary to keep that relationship healthy. That was critical for me to move into a healthy relationship with my mom. Because all those years serving her, I actually enabled her. And I actually gave up my life for her life. And that was not healthy. And so healthy boundaries is where I was able to establish a healthy relationship. She knows what I can give her, and I know what she can give me, and that's acceptable to both of us.
Hey, Jannette.
Yeah.
May I just add on the identify your why? One thing that I have found that was important in my own discovery and with my clients as well is that, rather than just looking at all of the behaviors as like good and bad, take time to celebrate the healthy behaviors we have now, but also identify that the behaviors, some of the actions that we had in our childhood, they may not serve us well now, but they did at the time. They helped us to survive. They helped us to, serve in the capacity that we could serve. And so one of the things I like to do is kind of help celebrate how those things served us well then, and then we can say goodbye to them nicely now. It just kind of takes some of the shame away. Like, why would I think like that? That's so stupid, and it's like, it wasn't stupid at the time. Like, it's not serving you well now, but it did serve you well then in the best capacity that you knew how. It helped you to survive, it helped you get through to this point. It just doesn't have a place in your life now. And so we kind of take time to thank it and then send it on its way. So
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
I absolutely love that. And that's such a great point, because you're right. It could have served a beautiful purpose as a child, but as an adult, you need to let it go.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I love that. Any other comments or questions? So I want to conclude with talking about the value of sharing your story. This scripture, by wisdom a house is built, and through understanding it is established. Through knowledge its rooms are filled with rare and beautiful treasures. Proverbs 24:3. Many times, children that are raised with a parent that's been through a traumatic experience, maybe suffering from mental illness, they're not given the full story because the parent thinks they're protecting the child from telling the specifics of the event. But research shows that by not sharing the full story with your children, you're actually creating toxic stress for that child. Because of what they don't know, they're going to fill in the blanks. And normally they're going to be very creative, and it's going to be a lot worse than the actual event. And the other thing is, if you're not telling them, then they absolutely think it's their fault. And so they're going to place the blame on themselves for the situation in the family. And of course, we've already talked about the parents. They keep it from the children, but then the children keep it from their peers because of fear of rejection. So I want to take this time just to say that we need to be sharing our stories. You know, for many years I didn't, and it was because the fear of rejection. But then one day God put in my heart that the imperfections of my life were really the source of the most valuable life lessons that I've learned. And by not sharing that with others, we're actually depriving them from learning from those experiences. We can share our experiences, and that may shorten their path on a very difficult road. And what better way to love others than doing that? So he really placed in my heart to truly show and share, show myself, my true self, but then share my story with others. And I remember when all of this was coming together for me, when I realized that I was within this anxiety cycle. My family was stuck there. I had unhealthy behaviors. I had no idea how to address them. And I remember crying out to God one night and just saying, I don't know what to do. I feel so alone. But God, if there's anyone out there that's going through the same thing as me, please give them discernment. Shine the light on the situation and help them not feel as alone as what I do right now. And his response to me was, share your story. So, here's why we should. Yeah.
Would you mind saying that phrase that you said again about imperfections in my life are really my source?
Yes, so the imperfections in my life were really the source for the most valuable life lessons I learned. Any other comments or questions?
One more time.
Now, you know, if you keep asking me, it's going to be different
I know.
every single way, but the imperfections in my life were the source for the most valuable life lessons I learned.
Next edition of your book, you'll want to have that front page.
That'll be front page, that'll be the title. Okay? So by sharing our story, our experiences, we have to do that to shed the light on the lasting effects anxiety has on families. We have to do that to break the anxiety cycle for others and ourselves. We have to let those know suffering from anxiety that they're not alone. And we also need to learn from each other's experiences. And the best way to do that is to share your story. So one thing I'd like to mention is, right now there's this discussion that stress is the biggest epidemic in our society right now. And that a lot of it has to do with the world's environment, that this is probably one of the most stressful and difficult generations, what they have to face on a global perspective. And I agree with that. But here's the question I have for you. After looking at all this information and realizing that anxiety can be the result of a trauma you experience or through learning it from someone, what if we were the one for individuals that stop that anxiety cycle so it's no longer being taught to future generations, and in its place, we teach those individuals coping mechanisms, how to manage stress in a healthy manner. And that's what they begin to teach to future generations. Don't you think that in our current environment, even though it is a very difficult time, that it would be managed better? that maybe stress wouldn't be considered an epidemic of this generation because we gave them the tools to deal with it. Because I truly believe there's 40 million individuals in the United States that have an anxiety disorder. I think that number's low. I think those are the ones that have been identified, have been diagnosed. I think it's much more widespread. And I do believe that the stress of today could be minimized if we stop the anxiety cycle and teach coping mechanisms so that now future generations are being taught how to respond in a healthy manner. So, with all of that, I have a charge for you today. And my charge is this: go out, share your story. Share the real one. Not the happy one, the elevator pitch that you normally share with everyone, but the good, the bad, the ugly. And come together so that we can be part of a new chapter for families and maybe even our own family. So this is my contact information. If I can be of service in any way, I would love to do so. Please feel free to reach out. If your organizations have a resource library and you think my book may be helpful to the people you serve, I'd love to gift you with a book. Just come see me afterwards. But I just want to say thank you so much for your time. It's been such a pleasure to be here.